Hey, Marrita, thanks for your work in week 8. Wanted to send you a video reply here to just give you some feedback, interact with you a little bit on the challenging questions here in week 8 for Romans 9 to 10. Um, there's part of your response where you quote me as saying, somehow Paul is supposedly implying two Israels here, one of physical descent and the other of faith. And in that part of my chapter, I'm sort of stating what people often interpret from Romans that I don't think is actually true to what Paul is saying. I don't think there is such thing as two Israels. Um, so let me see if I can kind of unpack that a little bit. I, first of all, think it's crucial to keep in mind how Paul begins this stage of his argument in Romans. And you see that in the first 5 verses of chapter 5, where he talks about these relatives of his that are Israelites, that are bearers of the promise, the covenants, et cetera, et cetera. And Paul is grieving for them. He doesn't actually tell us why. That comes a little bit later. And he doesn't tell us how many they are. What becomes clear is as the argument unfolds, especially in chapter 11, is that they have become enemies of the audience, actively opposing the audience in some way. And the audience of the letter is of Gentile background, Paul has said. And what becomes clear in chapter 11 is that Paul is speaking against their tendency to treat these enemies of theirs, who are Paul's relatives, as disinherited, as disowned, as no longer part of the people of Israel, and to regard themselves as having taken their place. And this, Paul is arguing, is not true to how God's people works or what the gospel is about. So that's where I think he's saying in chapter 9 at the beginning, when he says, not all who are of Israel are themselves Israel, he's saying that whoever survives as Israel over generations um, is Israel according to God's election. And this is not all in terms of the long past of Israel, because as we've seen, there are people like the 10 tribes of the north, who over generations assimilate to other Gentile peoples and lose their memory or their share in the future of Israel. And so, in that sense, those are people who are of Israel, but who do not themselves become Israel over generations because they find that their lives are woven out of Israel by assimilation to other peoples. But meanwhile, God maintains the memory of Israel among those who remain. And those are people like Paul's relatives who still call out to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as their God, have not assimilated to other peoples, have not forgotten who they are. And this is the work of God's election, Paul says. And the key, of course, is that it's a basis for the audience's patience with these relatives of Paul. Their refusal, or should be their avoiding any impulse to disown them or pretend to replace them, but instead to recognize that while their family is broken and divided, they're still a family that God holds together. That, I think, at least fits the purpose of Paul's argument as he specifies it in Romans 9 to 11. Relatedly, then, in line with what you're saying here in the second forum about this key section, chapter 10 of this argument of Romans 9 to 11, the audience have been saved. I think Paul takes for granted, but they've been saved as a gift. They've been saved by a word that God has inspired on their lips, the word, Jesus is Lord. They've been saved by faith that God has given them and placed in their hearts, that God has raised Jesus from among the dead. So the key is, I think, that they are witnesses to the way God saves people in God's family as an act of God's grace, as a gift, and not according to something they can point to about themselves and say, see, we obeyed God. See, we met certain conditions. See, we're people who observe God's law rightly, unlike those relatives of Paul's over there who do not. That, Paul says, is not how God um, saves people. Instead, God saves people as a gift. And that's what the Messiah is all about. So that, I think, is how that then key paragraph fits into the larger stage of the argument here in Romans 9 to 11. Hope that helps. Thanks again for your work in week 8.